Robert, it is such a pleasure to have you with me today. In fact, to be with all of us, to talk about something that you're so incredibly passionate about. Now, let me introduce Robert to everyone before we jump into the interview. Robert is a psychiatrist, he's a psychoanalyst, and he's also a Zen priest. He's Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And importantly for us, he directs the Harvard study of adult development. Now, if you haven't already heard about that, and I'm sure you have, then it's one of the longest running studies in the world about people's lives. And researchers like Robert are watching people from the very early stages of their life right the way through. In fact, there's been teams of researchers who have tracked two groups of people for more than 80 years. So if anybody knows anything about happiness and contentment and why we live as we do, Robert, it is you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Lynda.
Thank you, Robert. That's very kind of you. I mean, you and I have spoken a lot over the last year, but for those of you who don't know your work, I mean, what for you has been the real eye-opening things that you've learned as you've watched people and researched people through the course of their life?
The most eye-opening things are being able to watch entire lives and see what the early habits are that have long-term effects. Yeah. And so one of the eye-opening things will not surprise any of our listeners here, which is that if we take care of our bodies, it pays off, that we live longer, we stay healthier. And that means regular exercise, eating well, not abusing drugs or alcohol, getting good health care, all of that. But the surprise has been that when we want to predict who's going to stay healthy longer and who's going to live longer, when we look at their relationships, we find that the people who are more connected to others and the people who are more warmly connected to other people actually stay healthy and live longer. They get the diseases of aging later, if at all. Diabetes, heart disease, arthritis. And so these are powerful effects that at first we didn't even believe when we looked at our data, but then other research groups began to find the same thing.
I find that so fascinating. In the book, Robert, which I know isn't out yet, but just remind us of the title of it. So
it's called The Good Life, and it will be published in January. Yeah, we're very excited.
I was lucky enough to get a preview. And one of the things that really fascinated me about the book is that, you know, money is important, but actually when you looked at the happiest person in your sample, they were, if I recall, a teacher who wasn't earning a great deal of money, who certainly wasn't somebody that, you know, you'd say, oh my gosh, you know, they've done everything. And the least happiest was a lawyer who had earned a huge amount of money. And what really was the difference between them was the nature of their relationships and their connectivity. And I wanted to ask you, you know, before we dive into what do individuals and organizations do, what is it that you think's happening when we form close relationships with other people?
Yeah. Well, we've been studying that for the last 10 years, because the question is, how could relationships actually get into our bodies and affect our health? And the best hypothesis that scientists are working with is the idea that relationships are stress regulators, that life is full of stress, right? Things come along sometimes every hour, certainly every day, that stress us. And that's all right. And the body, you know, has certain characteristic responses. Our heart rates go up, our blood pressure goes up. We have circulating hormones that make us ready to fight or to flee. It's the fight or flight response. Not a problem. that the important thing is that when the stressor is removed, our bodies go back to baseline, to an equilibrium. What happens if you are chronically stressed? And what we know is that loneliness is a chronic stressor, that having acrimonious relationships with other people, constant conflict, is a chronic stressor. Then we think that the body stays in a kind of low-level chronic fight or flight mode, where there are higher levels of circulating stress hormones and higher blood pressure, all those things. And so the idea is that good relationships help us come back to that peaceful baseline. So, if you think about it, let's say some really upsetting thing happens during the day, and you go home and you have someone there to talk to who's a good listener and a sympathetic listener. You can literally feel your body calm down. That's the effect that we think good relationships have on us to preserve health.
Yeah, because and what I found really fascinating, as I've spoken to you over the years, Robert, and read your book, your latest book, is that most people don't predict that this is going to be good for them. And I think this is very interesting for the people who are listening today, because we sort of have an idea that, humans are very good at knowing what makes them happy. But one of the things that you've said is that we're very poor at predicting what will make us happy. And I'm going to say a bit more about that later, because I think it's really important for our conversation. But could you just say a bit about that?
Yes, there was a really interesting experiment that was done in another research group, where they met with people who were about to go on a subway ride in New York. And they assigned people at random to do one of two things. They either said to you, do what you normally do, read a book, read the newspaper, listen to your podcast that you love to listen to, but keep to yourself. And then the other group, they asked people to strike up a conversation with a stranger. And they asked each person, how much do you think you're going to enjoy the task we've just assigned you? Most of the people who were assigned to talk to a stranger thought they were not going to enjoy it. After people completed their assignment on their subway ride, they asked people again, how much did you enjoy this? The people who were assigned to talk to a stranger were much happier. They enjoyed it much more than the people who kept to themselves, which is an example of how we're not so good at predicting what's actually going to make us happy.
I mean, I guess that, there are things that we can do as individuals to help ourselves build better relationships and better friendships. But one of the questions that we're asking today is, in terms of keeping people in our organizations and keeping them, confident and happy. I'm thinking of that piece of, that the item study that says, people are more likely to stay at work because they have a friend at work. I mean, when we think about an organizational context, and let's face it, most of us, you and I included, spend much of our time at work. What's your view about friendships, relationships, and the role of how we design work?
Yes, there's good research on this now, for the first time in the last 5-10 years, because leaders often can believe that a lot of socializing at work, friendships at work are a distraction, that they would detract from productivity. But it turns out that in a survey of 15 million workers, the Gallup organization found that having a best friend at work has just the opposite effect, that in fact, people who say they have a best friend at work, someone they can talk to about their personal lives, that those people are better at engaging customers, they produce higher quality work, they're happier, they're less likely to leave their jobs. But when they asked people, do you have a best friend at work, only 3 out of 10, 30% of workers said they had this kind of friendship. So then they looked at the people who did not have a best friend at work, didn't have anybody who was a personal friend. And those people were much less likely to be engaged in their jobs. 11 out of 12 of those people who had no friend at work reported they weren't really very engaged in their work. The other thing that this survey found, they asked CEOs, and half of CEOs said that they felt lonely at work.
Yeah.
So what we're finding is that it happens from the top down, that many people feel isolated. And what we're learning is that changing this has to come from leadership. It has to start at the top and move its way down through an organization.
Before we come back and talk about leaders, I just wanted for a moment to discuss with you that really interesting finding that the loneliest age group are the young. I wondered if I think people aren't going to I think that's a very unexpected result, because we think that young people are incredibly sociable. But do you want to say something about that? Because I think it tells us a lot about how we think about young people when they enter our organizations.
Yes, we tend to imagine, we older adults, that young people are social and happy, and they're always going out to parties. And because I think in part we wish we were having that life again. And so I think many of us look at the young with some kind of wistful nostalgia for what wasn't true. That if we remember back to our 20s, for example, for many of us, it was a time of a lot of uncertainty, some insecurity. Am I going to find work that I enjoy, that I find meaningful? Am I going to find intimacy? Am I going to find good friends? Am I going to find an intimate partner? That all of those worries are important, and they can make us feel alone.
Yeah.
And so the finding that younger people tend to be among the loneliest turns out to have powerful implications for their lives that sometimes we can't see. Most people will not tell you they're lonely unless you directly ask, because no one wants to be seen as lonely.
Yes.
So I think part of what we need to do is remember the loneliness that can come with the uncertainty of early adult life.
Yeah. Just going back to that question about the CEO, the point that you raised earlier, Robert, that you think it starts from the top. What would your advice be to CEOs about this?
Well, for the CEOs themselves, find a peer group.
Yeah.
You know, I think many CEOs rightfully say, there's no one I can talk to about private matters because they're all my employees. Yeah. And that's a real legitimate concern. And that's why there are many peer organizations where CEOs can talk to each other, not just about business strategy, but about personal matters. And then in addition, CEOs can set an example of encouraging vulnerability, encouraging not needing to know all the answers, encouraging asking questions. That leading by that example can give other people permission to do the same.
Yeah, I know in our past conversations, Robert, we've talked about two other things, and I just wanted to rehearse those again. One was about, you know, we mentioned that nowadays, what we know now after hybrid is that the number of meetings has gone up by 50%. So people are frantically going from one meeting to another. And I know one of the points that you've made very powerfully is that it's often those times when you're just relaxing that friendships blossom. I mean, if you over diarize, you never have any time to make friends. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, it's such an important problem for us now, because how do we create opportunities for spontaneous conversations, for brainstorming when we don't expect to? That's why the coffee machine was such an important place at work, right? People would happen to run into each other in the workplace and have conversations they didn't expect to, with people perhaps from completely different areas of an organization. What we're trying to figure out is how can we create opportunities for that now that aren't there in the more formalized, structured meeting one after another on Zoom, on these virtual platforms. And I don't think this is a problem that has been solved yet, but there are many good minds working on the problem.
I think last time you and I spoke, I said that the person who wrote the Harvard Business Review article with me on managers, Diana Gerson, we'd done all of it on Zoom. We'd never met each other, but I'm pleased to tell you that we spent 2 days together in France a few weeks ago. And suddenly we're friends because we actually, talked about things properly. It's giving that time, isn't it? The other thing you've spoken about, which I think also, our audience can really consider, is the impact of voluntary work and social events that give people an opportunity to do things together, which aren't just always work related.
Yes, that what they find is that when people know about each other's personal lives, they work better in teams. And so having those chances to, maybe to be at a barbecue together, to see each other's children or partners, to be doing a hobby together, like gardening or playing golf, any of those things lets us get to know each other in a different context. Sometimes during meetings, actually, the US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has organized his work meetings so that for the first few minutes, one person on a team spends a few minutes talking about something in their life that nobody else would know about, something personal, usually a hobby that people didn't know about or something they're very passionate about. And what they find is that the team meetings are more exciting, people look forward to them more, and people work better together.
And I think, as we come out of the pandemic, giving time to make those strong relationships is going to be so crucial. Robert, just by way of finishing, we have it, arrayed in this audience, people from literally all over the world, some of whom have very significant roles within their organization. What would be your message to them about what you would love them to do? If you could have a magic wand, what would you want their organizations to be doing?
It would be to take care of relationships, to invest in them, to think of them as a precious commodity that needs your care and feeding, if you will. That relationships don't just take care of themselves, that we need to be intentional about making time, about putting energy into them at all levels of the organization.
And I just wanted to reflect back that word intentional. I think that as we move into this hyper-connected world, it's going to be really important that we're intentional about putting friendships and relationships at the center of what we're trying to do in organizations.
Your example, Lynda, is one of the best, where you wrote an article with a colleague, you did it all on Zoom, but then you intentionally invited her to come join you in France.
Yeah.
And so you moved offline, you moved it into the personal, and now you have a bond that's even stronger.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful thing. My mother was somebody who used to talk to every single person wherever she was. She'd be in a queue and she'd be talking to everyone, and it's a wonderful thing. Robert, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. And I hope everybody gets a chance. Once the book is out, we'll send a note to everyone so that they have a chance to read what I think. I absolutely adored it, as you know. I love the book. And I love the work that you're doing. And I wanted to say, on behalf of the whole community, thank you for the research that you do, Robert, and thank you for the way that you show us how important friendship and relationships are. Thank you.
Well, I always love talking to you, so anytime. My pleasure.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.